this is how I got second place in the Las Vegas Open. What I like about chess is you can always learn, you can always improve, you can always get better. And with chess, it doesn't matter how old you are, it doesn't matter where you come from, it doesn't matter how much money you have. At the end of the day, it's just you versus your opponent, and the better player will usually win. All right, so I did a little bit of prep in the hotel room, and I'm ready to go to the tournament hall. Let's see how it goes. All right, here we are at the playing hall. Games are about to start, and it's pretty cold, so I think I'm gonna go back to the room, get another sweater, because I don't want to be too cold. If my game is 3 hours long and I'm shivering, so just in case, I'm gonna go back to the room, get a sweater. It's helpful to know that I play white first, so I can just kind of have in mind my white openings. I don't have to worry about black for now until tomorrow. So go back to the room, get a sweater, and we'll come right back. All right, so game one was a win. I now have 30 minutes before my next game. I'll probably have the black pieces this time. And I'm hoping to do better with my calculation skills and pick up another 2 wins. So we'll see what happens. Game one was pretty interesting. I ended up playing the Pirc defense as white. And I'm not quite familiar with this opening as well as I'd like to be. It was a choice between the main line and the Austrian attack, and I decided, why not just go for the Austrian attack? It's way more fun, so that's what I did. But I didn't really have an idea of like the general plans of attack or whatever. I just sort of winged it, but it ended up working out in my favor. So we'll see what happens for these next 2 games. So the first game was against a 1436 rated player, and we played the Pirc defense, and I opened, as I said, with the Austrian attack. Here, after knight b to d7, I decided to push the center here, and he backs his knight away, and I do this very interesting play. I move the pawn forward once again, gambiting the pawn, but I get this very interesting position here, where if I can get my knight here, his queen is stuck, so he has to address this, and it gets a little bit tricky. Here he does the natural move, knight b6, basically freeing up the diagonal for this bishop, allowing it to defend the pawn on e6. And here I spent a while thinking about my next move. The top move I was considering was queen g4, and I spent a long time trying to calculate this to see if it would make it work. The idea here is if black were to play something like the natural knight f6, attacking the queen here, developing his knight with initiative, well, I would sidestep the queen here to queen h4. Now all I have to do is get rid of this knight on f6, and it's a checkmate. What I really like about this position is he can actually address it right away. For example, if he were to go something like h6, well, I'd take with the bishop here, and his pawn actually can't take my knight, because after f takes on g5, his knight now has to move, and it's a checkmate threat. If he were to go something like h5, well, I would simply take g6 with the bishop, and this position isn't looking great for black. But the problem I couldn't solve was after knight f6, queen h4, what if he just ignored this altogether? And what I failed to realize is just having this queen and this knight on these squares, just leaving them here, does so much for this position. For example, it's basically prophylactic against e5. He can never open up the center here because, like as we discussed, it would lead to this position. So in retrospect, if I was able to calculate this a little better and see that how much good this position does, like I don't even have to continue with this attack, I probably would have played it. But I was also nervous that maybe I was missing something, since there was a lot going on in this variation, and I also just have the safer move, queen e2, which, it looks a lot safer, and if I miscalculate something, it's probably not going to be as detrimental. Upon looking over this game more with the computer, I realized the best move here is actually h4, with the idea to play h5 and start a kingside attack. And believe it or not, this subtle pawn move is just unstoppable. For example, if black were to play the natural knight f6, well, if I push h5, he actually cannot take this pawn. For example, if he takes with the knight, I would take with my rook, sacrificing it, And if he takes back, well, I'd go bishop takes, check, and the king has to move, and then I would take queen h5, and this is actually a mate in 12. This is a long forced mate in 12, as you can see here, and the idea here is white would castle, bring the rook over to the h file, and black really can't move, and he can't address this, and white just goes on to win it. Now, if black were to take here with the pawn, well, I would still take with the rook, and if he takes my rook, I still take with the bishop here, check, and then I would follow up by taking his knight with my queen, and again, the same plan continues. It is a forced mate in 12. Every idea is the same. This line is just amazing. The best move after h4 per the computer, which is extremely hard for a human to find, is c5. It just looks very unnatural, but the idea here is for black to create more space and allow his other pieces to develop. Very hard to find. So anyway, after queen e2, black played e5 after much thought. I assumed that he must have looked at the exchange in the middle, and he must have seen something I didn't, but this position is just simply better for white, which I could have done a better job evaluating because I saw that, but since he took so long calculating, I was like, well, maybe I should be a little more efficient with what I think about and look for moves that he might have overlooked. And in haste, I moved bishop c4 check, forgetting that he can just simply play d5 here, which of course he did. And now I'm in trouble because I just blundered. So I moved the bishop back, and very luckily, by some miracle, black also blunders. He plays e4, forgetting that this pawn is actually pinned by this bishop to the king, right? So I can then just take with my queen here. And that's kind of the beauty of getting into these weird games right here that are, so unusual with gambits and such, is because players probably aren't used to pieces in the middle of the board being pinned like this. So it's easy to miss. So I go queen takes e4. I'm a little frustrated that I don't have a better counterplay here after such a blunder by my opponent, because he can still develop knight f6 and I just have to back the queen away. But anyway, we get to this simplification here. He offers a trade of queens. I happily take, and I feel my position is okay. I then decide to move h3, preventing the knight from going to g4. I don't want that knight to go there. I want to be able to safely castle. If the knight was there, it'd be super annoying. Now, by playing h3, I also weaken the g3 square, which I know is going to look super tempting for my opponent. He might consider playing h5, which he did, but this I was already prepared for with knight e2, and now his knight looks pretty dumb on this square. So now his next plan was to target my weak pawn here on f4, which isn't quite easy because I already have two defenders on it. I can possibly move g3. I have rook f1 coming, but this is what he goes for. So he starts by playing bishop h6. And now his pieces in the corner there I'm eyeing a lot because it looks like there's potentials for traps and such. So I decided to defend this pawn first by going rook f1. Computer says I could have also castled here, but my main plan was to castle long. My king is going to feel much safer on this side. Now my opponent goes e5, which is a blunder. And his idea was if I were to take here with d takes, he can then have this interesting tactic here, knight e5, and then it gets dicey. I can't really take here because then he just takes my bishop and it just gets super weird, right? If I take his rook, he can get his other rook into the game and he's looking very strong. I can't castle. It looks terrible. But the problem here is if he takes knight e4, the theme of this game, I can just go bishop d4, pinning this knight to his king, which I think he overlooked. Now, after moving e5, I take with my d-pawn, and now I think he realizes the horror of what just happened. So in desperation, he moves queen g8. However, this goes into another pin. Now this pawn is pinned, and this is just basically the story of the game. I can just simply win the game with g4, and his pieces look to be trapped, right? Because after knight goes to g7, his only safe square, I could then push the g-pawn again, and where's this bishop going to go? However, after playing this, I already saw that he has this move, which is super annoying. He can now counterattack my bishop. So if I were to take here, for example, he can then take with the knight, and that looks horrible. It's still favored for white, but it was just annoying that he had this counterplay available to him. However, he doesn't see this, and he decides to go knight takes f4, conceding that one of his minor pieces is going to be eliminated. Might as well take a pawn with it. Now here I had the choice between taking with the bishop or the knight, and I knew the knight was probably better, which the computer confirms, but I think the right play here was to take with the bishop, forcing a simplification of the position and just finding the safest way to close out this game and win. I don't want to take any risks or make the game more complicated than it is, or introduce possibilities of making blunders or mistakes. We end up getting into this position where he gets his king in kind of a nice, annoying position, and my bishop doesn't have much room to defend this pawn on h3. But I found this really nice play here that I'm very proud of, king d4, which took a bit of calculation. And I saw that he actually cannot take my bishop here now, because if he were to take, then I take his knight, then he can take my pawn. Now I go king f5, and I calculated this whole thing. Now his best attempt to win the game would probably be h5 here. And after I take, he then starts pushing his pawn to promotion, and I start pushing mine at the same time. The problem is, mine will promote first, one move ahead of his, and with check, because his king is on the h file. And I spent a lot of, like, the remainder of my time calculating this over and over and over, because if I make one miscalculation, I mean, I just lose the game. And this is a winning game. I'm not about to do that, so I wanted to make sure I calculated it right, and it was. So after I go king d4, he correctly moves the knight out of the way and keeps jumping around trying to find something, but eventually he can't, and the game is over. So I won my first game. I'm still having some adrenaline from it, and I decided to celebrate with some tacos and a margarita. Hopefully this isn't a bad idea. I have 2 games tomorrow, but yeah, I'm just happy I won. Next, I played the lowest rated player of the tournament. He was rated 1198, which means he was playing up a bracket. So he could have qualified and played in the under 1200 category, but he decided to play in the under 1500, which you're totally allowed to do. I would say that this was a pretty lucky pairing too, because he ended up winning his game against the highest rated opponent in the tournament, who was 1498. So I didn't know what to think. But yeah, we played an Evans Gambit. It was a pretty wild game. I was really excited to play this opening over the board, because usually when I play this, it's like in blitz games or 10-minute games, and you really need a lot of time to think, because right off the bat, the game gets very complicated, and oftentimes the best moves are the most wild ones. Here, the best move in this position for white is d4. It's the main line, contesting the center right away, but he decides to go queen b3, and I decide to defend against this by playing queen e7 like I normally do against this opening, and then he castles. Now, because he didn't play d4 right away, I can now contest this by playing bishop b6, which also blocks his queen from ever taking this b7 pawn in the future, and you know, has this nice diagonal against his queen here, which introduces tactical ideas for me. He decides to play d4 here. I take, and then he goes knight g5, and I don't really see what he's going to accomplish here, and I'm feeling pretty good here because I have so many ideas. And usually when I am in a position where I feel like I have a lot of ideas on the board, that's in my head how I assess that I have a very good position. So really it was deciding which move to play. I had a bunch of good ones. For example, I had this knight a5 just directly contesting this queen bishop battery here. I also could have played knight h6, developing this knight, preparing to castle, and protecting my pawn on f7. And the other move which I went with was knight e5, which I really like because I attack this bishop while also defending this pawn on f7, and I have these future check ideas which you'll see come into the game later. After I play knight e5, he does this very odd knight h3, and he's blitzing out all his moves, and I think that this move is very bad because basically the point of the Evans Gambit is you're gambiting a pawn to gain this very aggressive attack on the king side very early on, and you're sacrificing material to do it. You get this really complicated game very early on, and it can be pretty tricky for black to defend against it. However, when you're moving your pieces away from the attack, you're basically conceding the compensation that you have by gambiting that pawn. And now all I have to do is just continue to defend, and I'm up material, so naturally it should be pretty easy for me to close out this game and go on to win it. So I go d6, opening up this bishop here, attacking this knight, and to my surprise he goes bishop b2. Now I thought a better move would have been bishop g5, attacking my queen and still having some sort of attack against me, but I was already prepared to play knight f6 here, so it wasn't that bad for me. But because he played bishop b2 here, now this introduced a lot of tactics for me. For one, I could have just straight up played bishop takes h3 right away and damage his kingside pawn structure and then jump in with check on the knight. Now I decided to be a little bit tricky here and play knight f3 check first, and the correct move for him would have actually just been to move this king away, but he instantly takes. And now, this is the dream for me, I take now his knight with my bishop and also attack his rook at the same time. And now this position is looking terrible for him because I have this threat, this checkmate threat also looming. For example, if he just simply moves his rook away, well, now I go queen g5 and his king has only one move and I come in for the checkmate. So in desperation, he just goes bishop takes f7 check, giving up his minor piece to get rid of the pressure that I have. Now, here's the thing. In the Evans Gambit, if black is the one with the initiative and putting the pressure on, the game is just literally over. I mean, you've already given up material to have this attack, and if black is the one that's actually pressuring and pushing, the game's over. And it was basically game over at this point. I just had to simplify, close out the game, not make any mistakes, and that's exactly what I did. All right, we're now 2 for 2. Played a pretty wild game against a lower rated opponent, but cleaned it up pretty fast. And yeah, now we're just here enjoying some steak and eggs at Off the Strip near the link. My next game was against a 1400 rated player, and we played the Grand Prix, except it transposed into the closed Sicilian because he played d5, offering to convert into an open Sicilian. I didn't want to do it. I'm not comfortable with it, so I went g3. We eventually got into this position here, and here I thought for a very long time because it turns out I actually do have a winning play. I was looking at f5, but after knight e5, I didn't really see an option for white. Because black is threatening this pawn, and let's say I move my queen out of the way, well, black can just take this pawn. However, here I should have kept calculating because I have counterplay here. I can simply push f6 and black can, let's say, take on c1. I can then take with my pawn. Black can then fork my queen, okay, and I'll accept it and take my queen. And then I can take his queen, well, with a promotion. He'll then take my queen, and then I'll take his knight, and there you go. White is actually just a material here, okay? So it's an illusion that black can take this pawn. Now, I actually have a much easier play, which I, for whatever reason, didn't see. I mean, I considered it, but for whatever reason, I quickly wrote it off. But I can just simply go knight f6 check, sacrificing my knight. After he takes the knight, let's say with his bishop, I then can take his bishop, and now the resulting position for me is much better. However, for whatever reason, I didn't see the strength of f5, and I decided to go with bishop e3. A very gimmicky move because basically what I'm doing is I'm baiting him into taking this supposedly free pawn on d3. And let's say if he were to take, for example, I then move my rook to d1. He then has to move his queen away. And the queen doesn't really have a lot of great squares. I now take over this d file, and his king is not castled. Now if I go f5, it is extremely strong. Unfortunately, he doesn't take the bait, and he goes queen to d5. Now, I'm not liking my position so much this game, so my goal here was just to simplify into an endgame, maybe try to get a draw. Now, we get to this position here, and I go knight g5, which the computer doesn't like, but I figured it would give me enough counterplay and lead to an endgame that I could maybe win or draw. After I give him the pawn, he can now take my pawn on g7, and then I could infiltrate his 7th rank, which is very deadly and offers me a lot of counterplay opportunities. However, for whatever reason, he decides not to take this pawn and goes rook to d4, targeting my weak backwards pawn on d3. But now I just go rook takes f7, and just like that, I'm now winning the game. He offers to trade up the rooks. I then automatically take over the f-file with my rook, as it's the move that makes the most intuitive sense to me. I made it right away, but perhaps I should have thought longer about this move, because I could have also just went d4, eliminating this weak pawn from the game and getting into a pretty good position here where I feel pretty confident I can win or at least draw this game. Now, rook f1 here is also good, but it just might be a little bit harder to play. My goal here now is to get this king over into the middle of the board. And I know once this king is in the middle of the board, I should be pretty good to go. So I start walking my king over, and then we get into this position, and here I know I can cross, because if he were to check my king, I can still go to e2 and defend this rook. However, what I fail to overlook is he can still just take this rook, and now after I take with my king is very far away from the center, and his king can easily advance, and he should be able to win this game. I definitely made a mistake here. The correct play was not to move my king over right away, but ensure safe passage by playing rook f6. And now I'm completely safe to cross over with my king onto e5. Now all my opponent has to do is move his king into the center of the board, and he should be able to clean up this game pretty easily. However, by some miracle, my opponent blunders and plays e5. Now, you should almost always advance the king before the pawn, because your king can act as a barrier to the enemy king. But for whatever reason, he decides to go e5, and now I can move my king in a position where everything is defended. Now at this point, neither side can make progress. We repeated moves, and the game ended in a draw. 2 more games to go, and I'm going to try to make these reviews a little bit quicker. For the 4th game, I played the Grand Prix attack. What I like about the Grand Prix attack is white will get this really aggressive kingside attack, and it can be really tricky for black to defend against it. And even if black defends properly, oftentimes black will have devoted so many resources that now you can just back off on the attack, and even if they hold it, you have a winning endgame just because their pawn structure is weakened, or they devoted just too many resources just to defending it. So black not only has to defend against the attack, they have to defend in an efficient manner. Eventually we get to this position, and here I found my very first brilliancy over the board. After trading off the rooks to take over the e-file, black moves his queen to queen f8. And I notice here that the queen and the king are now in a forkable position. If I can somehow get this knight to e6, and black can't defend against it, I'm going to win the queen. However, I found an even more subtle and deadlier tactic. And if black doesn't see it, he loses the game on the spot. And even if he does see it, at best he can hope for equality. After knight g5, black did not see it. He moved d4, counterattacking my knight. Now, a lot of lower rated players here might think to instantly react to this. However, white has an even more powerful counterattack. First of all, knight e6 check does work here, and it's still a good move, but the move that I found over the board was knight takes h7. After I made this move, my opponent was literally scratching his head, and it took him about 5 to 10 minutes before he realized just how deadly this move is. And even then, I don't think he saw the follow-up to it. Here, black actually can't take the knight. If he does, white can go rook e7 check, and if the king moves away, it's a checkmate. Therefore, black has to take the rook, and white will win black's queen and win the game. Therefore, black must move the queen away. And now the question is, which square does the queen move to? My opponent eventually went with the natural move, queen d6. The idea is to move the queen out of the way of the knight's attack while also defending the knight on f6. However, this queen does not actually protect this knight. It's actually an illusion, because now the follow-up to this is simply knight takes on f6. and he cannot take this knight. If black were to try to take this knight with his queen, white then has rook e7 check. And if the king tries to run away, well, white just takes black's queen. So therefore, black has no other choice but to take the rook with the queen, and white will win the queen. Therefore, at this point, black has no other choice but to just ignore this knight. So black went bishop a6, freeing up this file for his rook. However, black's position is terrible here, and a6 is not a great square for this bishop to go to. And now, the queen is yet again in a forkable position, something that's easy to overlook when you're already trying to defend against another tactic. This is what makes this brilliancy just so beautiful, because white yet again has another fork here. Knight e8 check. And black has no choice but to take this knight with the rook, and now white can take the exchange with his own rook, and now white is just completely up material and winning this game. Black then took the knight on c3. I then went b takes c3, eliminating any chance of counterplay for this queen, and I went on to just completely win this game in convincing fashion. And now for the final and most wild game of the tournament. And of course, in dramatic fashion, board 1 finishes their game within 10 minutes. I haven't even made 10 moves in my game by the time their game finished, and all of a sudden, the person who was in first place lost their game in dramatic fashion. And now, if I were to win this game, I would be guaranteed first place. If I were to draw, I'm guaranteed second place. And if I were to lose, well, I'm probably not going to get any prize money. So right away, this game put things in perspective, and the pressure was on. And if it couldn't get any more dramatic, my opponent opens with one of the most wild and imbalanced openings in chess, the King's Gambit. Well, this game is probably not going to a draw. It's probably going to be a win or a loss. Against the King's Gambit, I like to play a Countergambit, f5. Not a very popular line, and white kind of has to know what to do in order to gain a good position here. Correctly, he takes the pawn on f5. I then push e4, and he goes knight g5. I go knight f6, preventing queen h5. He then makes a move I haven't seen quite often, bishop e2. The point of bishop e2 is to reinforce this check on h5. So now I spent some time thinking about how am I going to go about defending against this. And I didn't really see a good option, and I wasn't used to playing against this. I decided to go g6, defending the h5 square with the pawn, but severely weakening my king side. It turns out the computer just likes bishop c5, preventing a castle, and if white were to play bishop h5 check, computer says black is fine after king f8, you just sidestep the king, which seems just absolutely ridiculous. I mean, it looks like white has this very strong attack. They have this fork here with a knight, but after queen e8, if white were to take the rook with the knight, black can just go knight takes h5, defending the knight, and this knight is forever trapped, and black will actually win this knight back. So this crazy position is actually just winning for black, believe it or not. After the exchange of pawns, my opponent plays knight to c3. My two candidate moves were bishop c5, blocking the castle, and d5, taking control of the center. What I forgot to realize, I don't know why, or if it was just nerves or whatever, but he's tacking this pawn with two knights. So the only move for me really is d5 here. But I ended up going bishop c5, and of course, he just takes this pawn, and after this exchange, we have this position, and I am just crushed here. I was doing so well in this tournament, and I feel like I just threw everything away. I just hung the most important pawn in the game, and just look at this king side. Like, how am I going to recover from this game? If I were to even just get a draw, I would be very lucky, but getting a draw in a King's Gambit, I don't know if it's going to happen. I go bishop b6, white goes bishop c4, and I looked at this very confused because it looks like I just have d5 here forking his two minor pieces. So I play it, and after he takes instantly, I knew something was up. And I realized I can't just take with the queen here because he has this crazy fork. So props to my opponent for finding this tactic. Now it turns out black is just going to be okay here after knight d4. And I looked at this move for a very long time. The point of this move is you're preventing white from playing queen e2
with this x-ray on the king. However, I didn't see a play after white were to play, let's say, something like c3, pushing this knight away. But amazingly, the computer says that black is just fine after king f8, sidestepping the king, as ridiculous as this is, and getting the king off of the e-file. And now this bishop is attacked by the queen. If white were to take here, then the queen can then take the bishop, and black is just fine here. Black is down material, the king is out of place, but the compensation that black has is very, very powerful. All of black's pieces are developed, and black would have to make something happen. Unfortunately, I did not see this. I couldn't see past c3, so instead what I played was knight b5, preventing c3 altogether, because then black can just take white's bishop. And after knight b5, white played bishop b3, protecting the c2 square from the knight, which I was kind of bummed about because I was hoping to eventually fork this with my knight. It's looking really bad for me, but the crazy thing about this game is I have so much counterplay here and so much compensation. All white has to do is defend, and all I have to do is find some amazing attack that he might overlook. Okay, I spent a long time looking at queen h4 check. I spent some time looking at queen d4 with ideas to later checkmate here, but I just couldn't see a way to get rid of this knight, and I have no central pawns. So this position looks terrible for me. Eventually, I decide to go queen e7. After white plays d3, I decide to go with bishop e6, offering an exchange to the bishops with the hopes of getting my king to safety and castled. He exchanges, I take with the queen, and we reach this position. White plays a3, kicking my knight, and then plays a very defensive c3, preventing these squares from my knight and restricting its movement. However, I can breathe a sigh of relief because I was able to castle my king. And now I feel safe. I don't know if I can win this game, but in the moment, I feel okay. Next, white plays queen f3. And here I was deciding a long time between rook f8 or rook e8. The better move here would have been rook on h to e8. And I thought objectively this was the best move. However, I wanted to complicate this game because I felt that I was more behind than I was. I also noticed that my opponent was using a lot of his time. And I mean, so was I, but I felt I could be a little bit more comfortable with faster time controls, especially in an endgame where I feel pretty comfortable. So instead, I moved the rook on h to f8. White then went queen g3, getting out of this x-ray. And the crazy thing about this position is even though I'm down 3 pawns, I'm actually winning. And I had no idea. So there are a couple of ways I could have gone about this. One is moving the knight to a5 with eventual ideas to move the knight to b3. The other idea is to go king b8. The reason for this is because white can always simplify the game with queen h3. As long as the king is here on c8, white can always go queen h3, and I have no choice but to trade this queen. And then it would simplify into an endgame where white is up 3 pawns. Obviously, being down material, I want to avoid this if I can for as long as possible. Instead of taking these routes, again, not realizing that I'm actually ahead, I decided to go for more complications and play g5. The idea here is white can't actually take because black would have bishop f2 check, winning the queen. So instead, white plays rook to f1, defending this pawn. Here, we're both in time trouble, but I feel like lower time is going to favor me, being that the position is a lot more complicated for white, given I have so much compensation and I still have a lot of pieces on the board. All he has to do is defend, but defending is going to be a lot harder than it is for me to attack. The move I should have went here was king b8, getting out of this queen h3 idea. But I didn't do that. I went with knight to e7 with ideas to complicate things even further with eventual knight f5 ideas or knight d5 ideas. Now this is actually a blunder after white takes the pawn here, but I knew I had some tricks here. After white took the pawn, I went rook takes f1, white plays king takes f1, then I play rook f8 check, which to my surprise, he was caught off guard by and didn't know where to move. Now, having already calculated this, I knew his only move was probably king e2, but he had found this other idea, knight f6, which is not as good, but it's still pretty interesting. I then go knight to d5, with hopes to eventually win a pawn here with this pinned knight. And here I was punished for not moving king b8 earlier. White goes queen h3, forcing a simplification into an endgame. I trade the queens here, and then I trade the knight. Win a pawn, but I'm still down 3 pawns. Here we are in this endgame, and I have to find some way to trick him and draw this game. White went king g2, defending his pawns on h2 and h3. I went rook g6 check. He goes king f3. I then go rook g1, basically pinning this bishop here. He then goes d4, blocking in my bishop, so I then went c6. I was deciding between c5 or c6. I went with c6, but the computer says either are just as fine. He then went b4 with ideas to go bishop b2 and get his rook into the game and relieve this bishop from this pin. I then went bishop c7, targeting the pawn on h2. White went bishop b2. And obviously I don't want to trade rooks here when he's up material. I still want to keep things complicated. I went rook g8. And here white makes a mistake. He goes rook h1, looking to protect his pawns here. Now, the best play here would have just been to go h4, and this pawn is basically unstoppable. Fortunately, he's more worried about defending, and keep in mind, we're both in time trouble. Now he has less time than I do, and so he doesn't have a lot of time to calculate these long variations. So now I found this very interesting idea. Now I went rook h8, targeting the pawn on h3, and I knew if he would try to come here and defend it with his king, which he does, he goes king g3, I now have this perpetual check idea where he would have to either give up a pawn or accept a draw. So after rook g8 check, he goes king f3, and then I move back to rook h8. And now the decision is on. Does he give up this pawn or does he accept a draw? Now the problem with giving up this pawn is after this pawn, I will probably get this pawn too. We'll exchange rooks, and it'll be a bishop and 4 pawns versus a bishop and 3 pawns. The bishops are on the same color, which is usually a pretty drawish endgame. But white actually has a winning play here, which fortunately he did not see, probably because he's too worried about defending his material advantage. However, all he had to do here was go h4, and it actually doesn't matter if I take the pawn here on h4. Because now this pawn is completely going to be always protected by this rook on h1, and I actually will not be able to stop this pawn from promoting. Fortunately, he didn't see this, he didn't want to give up his pawns, and he was worried about losing an endgame where he'd be in time trouble. So he repeated moves, and after blundering my pawn in a King's Gambit game, I was able to pull off the draw and guarantee second place.
Alright, so my tournament results are in. I got 3 wins, 2 draws, and that guaranteed me second place.